An elderly man is shot dead in front of his family at a July 4th celebration. No one knows where the bullet came from. How can police track down his killer? A charismatic leader of the Black Panthers is killed in a police raid. His supporters say he was assassinated. The police claim they shot him in self-defense. Can a forensic expert determine who is lying? A child dies in a drive-by shooting. Can a state-of-the-art computer link evidence from this crime to another and win a conviction? It takes a split second for a gun to deliver death. Solving the crime takes much longer, but with increasing speed, expertise, and accuracy, forensic detectives are zeroing in on their deadly target. In Bloomingdale, Illinois, a small town 40 miles northwest of Chicago, July 4th, 1989 began like any other Independence Day. Like people all across America, families and friends gathered to celebrate the country's birthday by relaxing and holding the traditional backyard barbecue. Kids amused themselves with sparklers while eagerly waiting for the sun to set and the town fireworks display to begin. On the picnic grounds, a carnival provided an endless array of diversions, something for everyone to enjoy. But for one Bloomingdale family, the celebration ended in tragedy. In a field near the picnic grounds, the family joined a crowd gathered to await the fireworks. The grandfather passed time playing with his grandchildren. Then, without warning, he tumbled out of his chair. His wife thought he had a heart attack.
What's the matter? Is everything okay?
Two off-duty detectives happened to be picnicking with their own families nearby. They rushed to offer assistance. When they turned over the man's body, they found a bloody wound beneath his ribs, a bullet hole. This 64-year-old grandfather had been shot dead. Shock was followed almost immediately by mystification. No one had heard a shot or seen anything. A search of the field came up empty. No gun, not even a spent cartridge could be found. The killing was the most baffling case the Bloomingdale police had ever encountered. Who had shot the man and why? Unraveling the mystery, forging a link between victim and killer, would demand all the ingenuity forensic experts could muster. Lieutenant Richard Vaughn is the ballistics examiner at the DuPage County Sheriff's Department. As soon as an autopsy had been performed, the Bloomingdale police called him in. The coroner confirmed that a bullet had struck the victim on the right side, then penetrated beneath the rib cage, causing his death. He also recovered the bullet. Fortunately, it had not hit bone and was in near pristine condition. Vaughn's initial task was to try to establish what kind of gun had fired it, so he and detectives could begin to look for the gun and, ultimately, its owner. Under his scrutiny, the bullet's size and weight and any physical marks could provide vital information.
The evidence bullet in this case, the first question would be, what caliber is it? Caliber is determined by the weight of the bullet and by the diameter of the bullet.
Vaughn started by weighing the bullet on a digital balance. Then he measured it with an instrument called a micrometer. When the process was completed, he determined the bullet was a .44 caliber. It had come from one of the most powerful handguns on the market, a .44 Magnum revolver. Several companies manufacture such weapons. Vaughn had to determine the make and model of the one that shot the fatal bullet. He placed the bullet under a microscope and examined its rifling characteristics. All guns leave a series of spiral grooves on a bullet as it speeds down the barrel. The number of grooves, their width, and whether they twist to the left or right varies with the manufacturer. This particular bullet had 6 grooves and 6 lands, the raised regions in between. They spiraled along the bullet with a right-hand twist. Now Vaughn turned to a device called a measuring projection unit. It enabled him to accurately determine the widths of each land and groove. Armed with this information, Vaughn turned to a computer database called the General Rifling Characteristics File. Maintained by the FBI, it contains information about thousands of weapons. Feeding in the caliber, number, and width of lands and grooves, and the directional twist of the bullet, enabled him to identify the probable make of the gun.
We had a groove width measurement of 0.129 thousandths of an inch. When we then refer to the .44 Magnum caliber category, you will note that the probable make and model of firearm that could have fired the evidence bullet was a firearm manufactured by Sturm Ruger, and the model would be the Red Hawk model.
Within 2 hours, Vaughn developed a vital piece of evidence. The gun was a Sturm Ruger Red Hawk .44 Magnum. But a search of local gun shops turned up no record of any such weapon being sold. Vaughn decided the only way to trace the killer was to find where the bullet had been fired from.
We started out with this measurement where we had...
An ammunition manual told him that a Ruger Red Hawk .44 Magnum has a maximum range of about 1.5 miles. But the chances of locating where the bullet had been fired in an area that large would be next to impossible. To reduce the search area, Vaughn went back to the site of the killing to reconstruct the incident. All that he required was a mannequin, a lawn chair, and a wooden dowel. He seated the mannequin in the same place and position as the victim. Then he inserted the dowel through its body in the precise angle of the bullet wound.
The dowel rod now represents the actual trajectory of the bullet. Since we have an entrance wound here on the right side and the bullet was recovered on the left side, you'll note that the dowel rod is pointing in this direction here. We will now refer to this as the alleged flight path of the bullet.
The dowel pointed roughly northwest. If Vaughn was right, that was the direction from which the bullet had been fired. Back in his lab, he began to map out the area where the police should concentrate their search.
This is a Bloomingdale Township map which I was able to pick up at the Highway Department, which I took to the scene. And it demonstrates or depicts the search area. You'll note this area here is the open field in which the spectators were seated waiting for the 4th of July fireworks to occur in this area here. The decedent was seated in a chair here. Now, we had determined by a quadrant that our search area was going to be to the north and northwest.
But from where in this search area had the bullet been fired? Vaughn's references told him the muzzle velocity of a Red Hawk is 1,200 feet per second. But from the 15-inch deep wound in the dead man, a medical examiner estimated the bullet slowed down to less than 700 feet per second when it hit. With the help of a computer ballistics expert, Vaughn calculated how far the bullet must have traveled for its velocity to have been reduced to this amount.
We came to realize that the impact velocity being approximately 450 feet to 700 feet per second, that we would have to concentrate our search in an area between 500 yards and 700 yards. So our search area would have been in this span right here. So what we did is we actually established a cone of origin, if you will, where we would focus our search from this line depicted here to this roadway, which is depicted here.
After narrowing the search area, Vaughn and police combed the neighborhoods between 500 and 700 yards northwest of the picnic grounds. They conducted door-to-door interviews, searching for any evidence that a large caliber gun had been fired. Eventually, they arrived at a residence on Lawrence Avenue. During a search of the backyard, they made a crucial discovery. In a corner was a 55-gallon drum perforated with holes. Vaughn felt they could have been made by .44 caliber bullets. The edges showed little sign of rust, suggesting they were new. Had they been made by the same magnum that killed the elderly man? To find out, Vaughn had to recover one of the bullets and compare it to the bullet from the dead man. He relied once again on dowels to point him in the right direction. With luck, they'd lead him to a bullet.
We have evidence that the shots were fired at an angle where they entered a little bit higher than they exited. You also note that the metal on this side, that there's an indentation here, that the actual metal folds inside, which is indicative of this being where the bullet entered. And on the other side, we have evidence of the bullet exiting, where the metal fold is actually folding towards the outside. So this is indicative of the bullet exiting. So we're going to take this dowel rod here and we're going to reconstruct the trajectory. In other words, the flight path of the bullet from the time it struck the 55-gallon drum until it exits. Again, you can see the actual metal around the periphery of the hole, and the fact that it's folded out is indicative that this is an exit. So this would demonstrate that this bullet, continuing in a straight flight path, would most likely have hit the grass somewhere in here. So what we're going to have to do is focus our search on this area. We're going to have to conduct a grit search.
Vaughn and detectives spread out to find a bullet. Despite their thoroughness, they found nothing. Perhaps the barrel had been moved since the shots were fired through it. If so, metal detectors would be required to search a larger area. Then one of the deputy sheriffs had an idea. Perhaps the shooters had been burning logs in the barrel while using it as a target. Maybe the bullets were in the nearby pile of ashes. He sifted through the cinders and found what he was looking for. If Richard Vaughn could prove the bullet came from the same gun that killed the elderly man, he'd have the break he needed. When the man died in a picnic ground in Bloomingdale, Illinois on July 4th, police had only two clues: the bullet recovered at autopsy and the wound it left behind. Now, ballistic examiner Richard Vaughn had a second bullet, found near the 55-gallon drum. A comparison of the bullets would tell him if they came from the same gun. Every Ruger Red Hawk Magnum leaves similar rifling marks on a bullet. 6 lands and grooves with a right-hand twist. But every gun also leaves its own unique individual signature on the bullets it fires, produced by tiny irregularities in the rifling. The bullet found in the drum was deformed by the impact, but Vaughn was still able to discern a series of distinguishing marks. They were enough to conclude it came from the same weapon that killed the victim. The net was closing in, but an important question remained. Could a bullet fired from the backyard travel unobstructed for nearly a half-mile to the picnic grounds? Vaughn enlisted the help of an engineering firm to survey the bullet's likely path. They recorded ground elevations and the positions and heights of every house and tree between the Lawrence Avenue residence and the picnic grounds. Then they constructed a diagram.
The red line here demonstrates the calculated trajectory of the fatal bullet. The dark line here demonstrates the terrain. We do have documented here the dwellings that fell within the line of the trajectory of the fatal bullet. What we were able to determine was that this particular residence, for example, the bullet went directly to the right of it. But this indicates where the barrel of the firearm was. This is the fence that was at the back of the property, of the suspect's property. And this is the area where the decedent was seated.
On its half-mile journey to the picnic grounds were many potential obstacles. Amazingly, the bullet missed every one. But would it still possess enough power to kill once it got there? To make his case, Vaughn had to prove it could. He turned to wound ballistics expert Martin Fackler, who had devised a standardized way to test how far a bullet penetrates human flesh when traveling at various speeds. The depth of the wound depends on the velocity of the bullet. To simulate the penetrating power of a bullet after a half-mile flight, some gunpowder is removed to slow it down to between 400 and 700 feet per second.
This is referred to as a bullet inertia puller, and we're going to use this to pull and separate the bullet from the cartridge case so that we are able to actually remove the gunpowder from the cartridge case. Now that the bullet has been separated,
Vaughn carefully tips out a measured amount of the gunpowder. It's a trial and error process. Empty out some powder, fire around. Measure the bullet's speed. If it's too high, remove a little more gunpowder. If it's too low, remove a little less from the next round. To ensure that the bullet impacts the block at the intended velocity, its speed is measured with an electronic timer.
This is a chronograph. This is used to measure the speed of a moving projectile. It is nothing more than a timer, and the timer is started by the shadow of a bullet passing between these first two rods, and the timer is stopped by the shadow of the bullet passing between the second two rods. The speed in feet per second of the projectile is then recorded in the front of the machine.
Finally, when everything is set, the test bullet is fired into the gelatin.
Firing in the hole.
The bullet traveled 15 inches, almost identical to the depth of the fatal wound. What's more, like the bullet found in the victim, it had not deformed. The test proved that the bullet had enough power to kill the man from a half-mile away. Further evidence that the shot had been fired from Lawrence Avenue. The results of Vaughn's test gave Assistant State's Attorney Joe Burkett grounds to serve a search warrant on Robert Logsdon, resident of the home where the drum was found. Logsdon admitted he and his girlfriend held a party on July 4th. But at first, he denied owning a handgun. As a convicted felon, it was illegal for him to possess one.
He lied about virtually everything until he was confronted with facts that were known to us that we had put in the warrant, and he ultimately confessed and implicated his girlfriend as well in the shooting. There's a man who's dead.
Under pressure from Burkett, Logsdon produced a .44 caliber Strum Ruger Red Hawk. He later confessed and revealed the events of his party. It had started ordinarily enough, a barbecue for a few close friends. Sometime in the afternoon, Logsdon had gone into the house to fetch his Ruger Red Hawk. A jug of water was placed on the 55-gallon drum as a target. Logsdon fired off 5 rounds. 1 hit the jug, but 4 missed and hit the drum instead. Then he handed the gun to his girlfriend, whose shot missed the jug and drum completely. From Logsdon's statement, Vaughn determined that the girlfriend fired the fatal bullet. Because she was shorter than Logsdon, she tilted the gun higher. The increased angle gave the bullet a trajectory high enough to reach the picnic grounds. Logsdon pleaded guilty to unlawful use of a handgun, to possessing a stolen weapon, and to involuntary manslaughter. His girlfriend also admitted firing the gun and likewise pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. Logsdon was sentenced to 6 years. His girlfriend received 90 days plus plus probation.
It was really just a tremendously successful investigation because, as with any murder or any homicide, police officers and prosecutors don't take holidays. We worked closely with the Sheriff's Office, the Coroner's Office, Bloomingdale Police Department, Sergeant Vaughn and the crime lab. Everybody did an excellent job.
In Bloomingdale, victim and killer were completely unaware of each other's existence and were a half-mile apart. It took the tools of forensic science and the dedication of law enforcement professionals and ballistics experts to bridge the gap. The Bloomingdale death was a tragic accident caused by carelessness and an astonishing twist of fate. Its randomness made it a challenge to solve. In Chicago, during the turbulent 1960s, an investigator struggled with a different challenge. A political activist lay dead. Was he killed in self-defense or assassinated? The bullet-riddled walls held the answer. December 4th, 1969, 4:45 a.m. 14 police officers, handpicked by Illinois State Attorney Edward Hanrahan, approached an apartment in Chicago's Oak Park area, the heart of the city's black ghetto. They were about to embark on what would become one of the most controversial events in Chicago's history. The first-floor apartment was occupied by members of the Black Panther Party, a militant left-wing organization that preached social revolution. As the main group of police entered the front, a smaller force came in at the back. 15 minutes later, the tiny two-bedroom apartment was laced with 100 bullets. When the smoke cleared, 2 young Panthers were dead. 4 more were injured, 2 of them seriously. 2 policemen received superficial wounds. The raid yielded a cache of arms, 19 guns and boxes of ammunition. Among the dead was Fred Hampton, age 21, the charismatic leader of the Panthers' Illinois chapter.
Black people need some peace. White people need some peace. And we are going to have to fight. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to struggle relentlessly to bring about some peace.
Hampton was the 28th Black Panther killed by police in less than 2 years. The Black Panthers emerged in Oakland, California, a product of the 1960s social unrest. While black leaders such as Martin Luther King advocated civil disobedience and political action to advance civil rights, the Panthers seemed prepared to use violence if necessary. The December 4th raid quickly became a media event, as the Panthers and the authorities gave radically different accounts of what happened. Hanrahan claimed the police were serving a legitimate search warrant when the Panthers started shooting.
When the police officers announced their office, they were fired upon.
In a filmed demonstration, the police gave their account of the raid. In this version, Panther Mark Clark was sitting in a chair in the living room. He fired a shotgun through the front door as police approached. Police then burst in and shot him dead. As more Panthers began shooting, the exchange escalated.
There were 3 shots fired from the rear bedroom. They were directed directly at the back door as I was coming in. I backed out again.
According to police, when they entered Hampton's bedroom, they found him in bed, lying on his stomach. He opened fire with a .45 caliber automatic and a shotgun. In self-defense, they shot him twice in the head. But the Black Panthers told a different tale. The police burst in without warning, started shooting, and killed Mark Clark, who fired only after being fired upon. No other Panther used a weapon. More police stormed in from the back, found Fred Hampton asleep, and shot him twice in the head before he had a chance to wake up. Hampton's girlfriend was in bed with him when the raid began.
Still half asleep, I looked up and I saw bullets coming from, it looked like the front of the apartment, from the kitchen area. They were, pigs were just shooting. When he looked up, just looked up, he didn't say a word, and he didn't move, except for moving his head up. He laid his head back down to the side like that. He never said a word, and he never got up out the bed.
The Panthers were convinced that Fred Hampton was assassinated and that police had launched a full-scale cover-up. Panther lawyer Skip Andrew acted as their spokesman.
Anyone who went through that apartment and examined the evidence that was remaining there could come to only one conclusion, and that is that Fred Hampton, 21 years old and a member of a militant, well-known militant group, was murdered in his bed, probably as he lay asleep.
Police arrested the surviving Panthers and charged them with several offenses, including attempted murder. To defend the Panthers, their lawyers needed evidence to support their version of the raid. They turned to ballistics expert Herbert McDonnell. He seemed an unlikely choice. More than once, he had investigated gunfights between the police and black radical groups. He usually sided with the police.
I understood it was a shootout, similar to the ones I'd investigated before in the Republic of New Africa and Fred Ahmed Evans and others. So I expected this would be another black militant group who were in the wrong and the police were in the right.
As McDonnell saw his role, it was to decide whether the police or the Panther account of the raid was nearer the truth. To determine this, he would have to reconstruct the raid from bullet holes and spent bullets in the apartment. It would take all of McDonnell's skill to find out what happened. He entered the apartment through a small foyer, which led to the living room. Mark Clark, the first Panther to die, had been shot here. Beyond the living room were two bedrooms. Fred Hampton had died in the farther one. Finally, at the back, lay the kitchen, through which the rear contingent of Hanrahan's force had entered. McDonnell started his investigation in the living room.
I spent 10.5 hours collecting evidence, taking photographs, and observing the trajectories of various bullets. I had never seen an area that had been so shot up as the living room. On one wall, the south wall, there were 45 bullet holes of various calibers. The larger ones were 45 caliber fired from a Thompson submachine gun. There were blasts from shotguns, and there were 30 caliber and 38. Having different sizes made it somewhat easy to establish which were fired from various weapons.
Who had fired these shots, the Panthers or the police? McDonnell hoped his investigation would provide the answer. As streams of sightseers trooped through the apartment, McDonnell set to work, unpacking the simple tools of his trade: a camera, notebook, ruler, and a ball of string. Soon he made a curious request.
I asked if I could have some straws brought in and some dowels. The Panthers went out, some of them, and they came back very quickly with a big handful of straws and a bundle of dowels, small ones.
After measuring the precise position of every hole in the living room wall, McDonnell gently pushed the dowels and straws into them. By following the direction of a dowel, he could trace the path of a bullet. The straws protected the holes, ensuring that a dowel did not knock out plaster and destroy vital evidence. When he finished, the result was startling. All 45 bullets had been fired from the vicinity of the living room door. All must have come from the police as they burst into the room.
When I began looking at the number of bullet holes, it became apparent that the vast majority seemed to be coming into the apartment rather than going out.
The investigation seemed to be favoring the Panthers' version of the raid, but the police were quick to state their case. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune, Hanrahan produced a photograph of bullet holes in the molding around the back door. He called it irrefutable evidence that the Panthers had fired at the police as they entered from the rear of the apartment. Reporters studied the photos.
One of the 4 pictures you gave the Tribune had 2 bullet holes on the right side of what was supposed to be the rear door.
But when reporters inspected the apartment, they found the marks to be not holes, but nails. Hanrahan backpedaled.
I have said that we released the pictures. We have not characterized or described the conditions that they portray, other than to say that that is an accurate portrayal of that particular object.
Now the police changed their story. The Panther bullets, they said, whistled through the open door. That is not what McDonnell found.
The claims that there were bullets fired out at the police out the back door are unfounded. There is no way the bullets could not have hit a person in the door, and if they missed them, they would have struck a brick wall.
McDonnell continued his investigation in the front bedroom, where he discovered bullets fired in the living room had passed through the wall. While in the bedroom, he noticed the door was also pierced by bullets. He counted 25 of them. The police had claimed Panthers in the bedroom shot at them and refused to stop firing despite orders from officers. At first sight, the door seemed to confirm this part of the police's story. All the shots in the door came from the inside out, exactly what would be expected if Panthers in the bedroom had been shooting at the police. But there was a puzzle. None of those 25 shots hit an officer, nor was there any trace of them in the hallway beyond.
But on closer examination, if those bullets were fired when the door was closed, as was claimed by the police, they would have struck the hall right across from that bedroom door. There was not one point of impact there. So having the dowels between the living room and that bedroom recessed, I could open the door all the way, and then all I had to do was to push the dowels from the living room side, and out of the 25 holes in the door, 25 were explained by the bullets coming from the living room when the door was wide open.
When these shots had been fired, he concluded, the bedroom door was open, roughly parallel to the bedroom wall. Bullets fired by the police in the living room passed through the wall, then continued on through the door. By now, the evidence was overwhelming. Of all the bullets fired, only one, a shotgun blast in the living room door, seemed to have been fired by a Black Panther. This was beginning to look like a very one-sided gunfight.
There were at least 99 fired in. So when you have 99 to 1, it's not a shootout. It's a shoot-in.
But what happened in the back bedroom when Hampton lost his life? Was he waiting in bed, ready to fire, as police claimed? Or was he asleep and murdered in cold blood by the police, as the Panthers insisted? The trajectory of the bullets through his skull might solve the riddle. On January 3, 1970, a federal grand jury ordered Hampton's body exhumed. 2 earlier autopsies had given conflicting results. One, conducted by the Cook County coroner, reported that the 2 bullets in his head came from opposite directions. That suggested he was awake and moving. Hampton's relatives arranged a second one by a private pathologist. He found that both bullets had struck from the right and traveled on roughly parallel paths, suggesting Hampton was lying down. The new autopsy confirmed the second one regarding the trajectory. Both shots had entered Hampton's head from the right. The findings supported the Black Panther's claim that Hampton had been asleep, lying on his back with his head down.
From the trajectory into the head of Fred Hampton, both shots were fired in nearly parallel trajectories which projected back to the doorway. So if one policeman came in and fired a shot, Fred would have still been lying in that position when the second person came in with a different caliber and fired a second shot at what probably was either a dead or dying person.
McDonald's meticulous investigation and the autopsy supported the Panther version of events. It looked as if the police had indeed assassinated Fred Hampton. But the most crucial question had not yet been answered. Did the Panthers or the police fire first? If the Panthers had started the shooting, even if they had fired just a single shot, the police could maintain they shot back only in self-defense. To answer this question, McDonald performed his most dazzling piece of detective work. The gunfight evidently had started as the police stormed the living room. McDonald found that the living room door contained 2 bullet holes. His examination of powder marks and wood splinters established that one bullet came from outside, from a police .38 revolver. He recovered the bullet from the living room wall. A second, larger hole likely came from Mark Clark's shotgun. After blasting a hole in the door panel, the slug had gone through a wall and ended up in the stairwell outside the apartment. McDonald had an idea. By figuring out how far the door was open when the .38 bullet and the shotgun slug passed through it, he might be able to tell who shot first. He traced the bullets' paths as they flew through the door. He knew that, by their own admission, the police had forced open the door as the raid began. He threaded a string through the .38 caliber hole in the door to the .38 hole in the wall. Then he adjusted the door until the string was straight. The door was barely ajar. Next, he ran a line from the slug hole in the stairwell through the hole in the door and then to Mark Clark's chair. This time, when the string was pulled straight, the door was 3/4 open. Through his experiments, McDonald pieced together the scenario. As police pushed open the door at the start of the raid, they fired the .38. As it swung open further, a Panther shotgun went off.
That was the only evidence of any shot being fired out.
McDonald's conclusion was clear. The police fired first. According to McDonald's findings, the police broke in, firing a .38 caliber pistol as they slammed open the living room door. A Panther, presumably Mark Clark, returned the fire. As the fusillade of police bullets poured into the apartment, Panthers fled to the second bedroom, where they tried in vain to awaken Fred Hampton. When the police reached the bedroom, they shot Hampton twice in the head. In court, charges against the surviving 7 Black Panthers were eventually dropped. No indictments were ever handed down against State Attorney Hanrahan or the 14 officers involved in the raid. But Hanrahan's credibility had been tarnished, and his political career was ruined. 12 years later, in a civil suit brought by the Panther survivors, the raiders were found liable, and the city ordered to pay $1.8 million in damages. McDonald's detailed investigation helped to tip the scales and ensure that in the end, justice was done. It's been 30 years since Fred Hampton's death, but today, crime solving takes as much tenacity and ingenuity as ever. Investigators are finding a new ally in the computer. It's proving time and again that a criminal's past can catch up with him. On March 8, 1996, a young boy was spending the evening as any 12-year-old would, when tragedy struck. A gang war simmered on the streets of his New Orleans neighborhood. The boy became a casualty of that war, a bullet in his head from a senseless drive-by shooting. Within minutes, police and paramedics were on the scene. They rushed to save the boy's life, but from the start, the prognosis looked grim. Homicide detectives from the New Orleans Police Department began interviewing eyewitnesses. 2 men who had run for safety when the drive-by occurred returned to the scene. One of them was the victim's uncle. The men admitted to police that they were the intended victims. They recognized the car and identified the triggerman as Kevin Jordan, a gang member and drug dealer. Meanwhile, the child was taken to the hospital. 15 hours later, he died. As the search for Kevin Jordan started, Sergeant Michael Rice and John Treadaway, firearms examiner for the New Orleans Police, began their own quest. 2 bullets had been found at the crime scene, and a 3rd had been recovered from the little boy. Could they link those bullets to a gun, and then link that gun to the killer?
The bullet was placed in our evidence room, and it was delivered to the firearms section for me to examine. Examining the bullet, I found that it was a .38 caliber having a 6 right rifling twist.
Most drive-by shootings involve semi-automatic handguns, but this bullet was fired from a revolver.
So I was able to inform the Detective Bureau that the gun that was used was a .38 caliber revolver.
But were all 3 bullets fired from the same .38? To find out, Treadaway had to compare the fine details of each one.
So, you see how pronounced this is? If you look up on the monitor in the groove, you can see about 2/3 of the way down, it's a good match. It matches on the following land and the following groove. This is a hit, no doubt at all. This is both bullets fired from the same weapon, no doubt.
Okay. And I think this is what they needed.
Now, detectives in the field knew that only a single .38 revolver had been used. Until they found it, there was little more that Treadaway could do.
Open the door, please.
Detectives, meanwhile, learned the name of the driver. He was Henry Talley. They also found out he owned a .38 caliber revolver. On March 16th, they arrived at Talley's home, armed with search warrants. A search turned up drug paraphernalia, marijuana, crack cocaine, and 3 guns, including his .38 caliber revolver. He was taken in for questioning. Talley's weapons were confiscated and sent to Treadaway at the Ballistics laboratory. Could he tie the .38 revolver to the bullet that killed the boy? If so, the police could build a solid case against Talley and the alleged triggerman, Kevin Jordan, who had already been arrested on suspicion of murder. The first order of business was testing for fingerprints. Had Talley or Jordan last fired the gun and left prints on the trigger? Timothy Susano, a fingerprint expert with New Orleans Police Department, demonstrates how he finds them. Latent fingerprints, prints invisible to the naked eye, are developed in a 2-stage process. The first involves fumigating with superglue. Molecules of the glue will stick to a print.
Then you want to take your liquid superglue and pour it into the aluminum dish. Next, I'm going to place the aluminum dish onto a hot plate that's located inside this tank. That's going to heat the superglue and accelerate the fuming process.
Within an hour, the gun is cooked. Now it's ready for the second stage of the test. It's washed with a fluorescent dye. If any prints exist, the dye will adhere to them and become visible under the ultraviolet light source. Unfortunately, none showed up on the .38 found at Talley's residence. The test could not help pin the shooting on Talley or Jordan. Still, the test is often worth performing. Sometimes it can yield dramatic results.
This is an example of a partial latent fingerprint that was developed on the trigger guard of a weapon that was used in a murder. As you can see, the partial fingerprint right here, that's on the front part of the trigger guard, which is located right here.
To establish a connection between Talley's gun and the fatal bullet, Treadaway needed to inspect a bullet shot from the gun.
This is our ballistic recovery room. In this room is our ballistic tank that we test fire our weapons in. This is Officer Gwen Surpass. He's going to test fire these weapons.
We're going to test fire this 38 first. Before we do anything with it, we normally like to check to make sure that the weapon is functional. We make sure that there are no obstructions in the barrel and all the parts on the weapon are in place. I'm gonna go ahead and load it. We're gonna need to put some ear protection on. It gets a little loud in here.
The gun is fired into an 800-gallon tank of water, informally called the hot tub. Water halts the bullet without distorting its shape or marking its surface.
Once the weapon's fired, I then unload the weapon, remove the spent casings.
The bullet retrieval system is simple but effective. A broom handle and a lump of silly putty. Once the bullet was recovered, its markings were examined and compared with bullets found at the crime scene. The match was undeniable.
So I performed my test fire and examined the bullet, the test bullet, under the microscope with the 3 bullets that I received previously and determined that that gun had fired those 3 bullets.
Talley's gun had indeed shot the little boy. Both Talley and Jordan were convicted felons, and by now the New Orleans police had enough evidence to charge Jordan with murder. But they suspected that the guns found in Talley's house had been used in other crimes. Could a new computer system implicate Talley in past crimes? When the 12-year-old boy died in a drive-by shooting in 1996, New Orleans police had a brand new crime-solving tool available. Earlier that year, they installed the Integrated Ballistic Identification System, or Ibis. It dramatically speeds up the time it takes to match bullets from crime scenes to guns confiscated by police. Sergeant Michael Rice runs the Ibis operation. For him, it's a vast improvement from the old method.
We would go and physically get these guns and test fire them and examine them on the microscope. Well, right now, with our Ibis system, we can now simply, as a matter of routine, test fire these weapons and put them into Ibis. This image will then be correlated and checked against all of our current database. And if this gun had been used in a crime, we will know about it in a very short period of time, perhaps within the hour.
At the heart of Ibis is a sophisticated computer program linked to an elaborate microscope. Attached to the microscope are 2 tiny video cameras. When a test bullet is placed under one of the cameras, its magnified image appears on the screen. Greg McCrae is one of the New Orleans detectives trained to use the new system.
We have the projectile, the bullet itself, mounted on a little fixture with the information recorded on it. It's glued on here. I'm going to mount it to the machine, rotate it, and lock it in.
At the flip of a switch, the cradle begins to move, turning the bullet through one complete revolution, scanning an image of the bullet into the computer.
As you can see, you see striations, you see groovings, you see markings. As we move it down, we'll take a picture of it. The machine digitizes this picture as it takes it. Now, when we process it, the picture is taken and then processed digitally from this machine into the next machine, the next computer, which will in turn correlate it.
Built into Ibis is a program designed to scan each image for its distinctive pattern of marks or lines. Having picked it out, the program searches through its database looking for other images of bullets that match. Within less than a minute, it can scrutinize thousands of bullets, a task that would take a ballistics expert like John Treadaway years to perform. This part of Ibis is called bulletproof. A second subsystem, Brass Catcher, enables him to scan and match spent shells.
The casing, which is the other section of the bullet, would be put in this area here and locked in here and secured. This particular microscope will take a picture with the camera mounted up here of the back end, or I should say the breech face of that casing. The breech face and also the firing pin, which is in this area right here.
Now the computer records the shell's distinctive features, the positions and shapes of indentations left by the firing pin and tiny gouges left as it's ejected from the weapon. The operation is completed in 2 to 3 minutes. Ibis had been installed less than a month when a bullet from the .38 revolver that killed the 12-year-old boy was entered into it. There were no hits, no matches with the thousands of other bullets in the computer's database. But the system's real power was demonstrated with bullets test-fired from a second gun, a .45 caliber automatic found in Henry Talley's apartment.
The firing pin, which we're looking at, if you look very closely, you can see this duck image right here, center in the firing pin itself.
But this is very clear. We knew from looking at the screen that the probability of a match was very, very high.
Ibis made a hit, implicating Henry Talley in another unsolved drive-by shooting. It was enough to strengthen the case against him regarding the death of the child. Ibis had proved itself on its first case.
Prior to Ibis, this case would have probably been unsolved. It would have never picked up any additional follow-up unless there was a specific reason for it. We have uncovered and linked many cases involving homicides as well as shootings here in the city. And we made those links and those correlations and tied them all together by simply what Greg's doing right now. And we're kind of proud of what we do here, and I would not want to be without Ibis today.
The death of the 12-year-old boy was solved partly by traditional ballistics work. But without the Ibis computer system, police would never have connected Talley's weapons to another crime that might have otherwise gone unsolved. Both Kevin Jordan and Henry Talley were convicted of first-degree murder and are now serving life sentences. By developing new ways to trace bullets to guns and guns to criminals, forensic detectives are increasingly able to turn a criminal's own ammunition against him. So long as there's a bullet, there's a clue. And so long as there's a clue, there's a chance to catch a killer. A hat, a glove, a trail of blood. Investigators believed they led to a killer. The prosecution thought it had an airtight case. Hard evidence, bolstered by rigid science. The defense argued the evidence was tainted and the science was shoddy. The jury expressed reasonable doubt about the guilt of Orenthal James Simpson and serious doubts about forensics. In courts of law and the halls of science, it was the trial of the century. Los Angeles, California. A town famous for sunshine, celebrities, and scandal. But even by LA standards, the events of June 1994 were electrifying. In an affluent suburb, 2 people were found brutally murdered. The prime suspect was a football star turned film actor. All eyes focused on the Los Angeles County Courthouse as the trial unfolded like a Hollywood movie. For 10 months, the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson played out in the courtroom and on televisions around the world. On October 3rd, 1995, the world held its breath as the jury rendered its decision. It took just under 3 hours to reach its verdict.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being as charged.
The verdict was a shock to the Los Angeles County District Attorneys who tried the case and to the families of the victims. But for the defense, it was confirmation that the quality of the evidence must be weighed before depriving a person of his freedom. From the start, Simpson was also being tried in the court of public opinion. Though many applauded the verdict, others were stunned. Homicide Detective Tom Lang of the Los Angeles Police Department was one of the men in charge of overseeing the evidence collection at the crime scene.
There are people on death row. Death row. There are people that have indeed been put to death on much, much less evidence, on a tenth of that evidence.
Defense attorney Barry Scheck was a member of Simpson's dream team and one of the most vocal critics of how the evidence against O.J. Simpson was collected and processed.
The way that crime scene was handled by the criminalists from the Los Angeles Police Department, by the people in the crime lab when they did the initial DNA testing, and by the medical examiner's office was shameful.
Soon after the trial began, it became clear that more than Simpson was on trial. Forensic science would also have its day in court. Could the evidence and the methods under which it was collected withstand the defense team's harsh scrutiny? There were no eyewitnesses to the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman. But from the very beginning, the prosecution thought strong circumstantial evidence pointed to the killer. In the Brentwood section of Los Angeles, in the early morning of June 13, 1994, a dog led some neighbors to the front walk of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium. There lay the mutilated bodies of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman. Their killer, or killers, had slit their throats. Bloody shoe prints and drops of blood to the left of them led away from the murder scene toward a back alley. Police believed the prints belonged to someone who'd been bleeding from the left hand as he quit the scene. Also found near the bodies were a blood-soaked glove and a pullover cap. The killer had apparently left them behind. After the crime scene had been secured, the officers called the Homicide Division. Detective Lang received a call at 3 a.m. on the 13th to take charge of the investigation. He arrived at the scene around 4:25 a.m.
The first impression was that it was an overkill, probably some type of rage killing, that there was one killer.
The ground was littered with potential clues. A leather glove, a ski cap, Ronald Goldman's pager, and his car keys, a dog's footprints in the blood, and one set of size 12 shoe prints leading away from the bodies. Detectives had to determine which were important. They started with the blood.
Along with the heel-to-toe stride analysis of the bloody shoe prints, told us that the source was in fact walking. Not what you would expect after committing a brutal double murder. There's an interruption in his gait, and he stops, and there's 2 or 3 prints that point back towards where he was, indicating the possibility that the killer stopped and looked back. Now, when he did that, was he looking, say, hey, I lost my cap, I lost my glove, should I go back and get them? No, I better get out of here, it's very dark down there. So that may have been that hesitation in that stride that we saw in those bloody shoe prints.
At the request of his superior, Lang left the crime scene to notify the victim's estranged husband, former football star and broadcaster O.J. Simpson, that his ex-wife had been killed. He traveled the short distance to Simpson's home on North Rockingham Drive with his partner Phil Van Natter and other detectives assigned to the case. One of them named Mark Furman. It was the first time Lang and Van Natter had worked with Furman.
Mr. Simpson, this is the police. Mr. Simpson, this is the police. Will you please open the gate?
They approached the front gate of Simpson's home. Though they could see lights on in the house, no one responded to the buzzer. According to the testimony of Mark Furman at trial, he then noticed a white Ford Bronco outside the gate. It was parked at an odd angle. Through the window, he saw a small black bag bearing the label Orenthal Productions. Furman concluded the car belonged to O.J. Simpson. He then called Tom Lang over to show him something else he had found. Near the door handle on the driver's side, there appeared to be a spot of blood. Lang testified that the detectives feared Simpson was injured and decided to enter Simpson's property to investigate, even though they didn't have a warrant. Furman climbed over the 5-foot wall and let the other detectives in. Lang and Van Natter checked the front door, while Furman investigated behind the house. It didn't appear as if anyone was home. Detectives roused Cato Kalin from a bungalow at the rear of the house. Kalin, a guest of Simpson's, wasn't certain of Simpson's whereabouts, but told the detectives he'd heard several loud thumps behind his room earlier that evening. Police later learned that Simpson had left hours earlier for Chicago. While the other detectives continued their search, Furman, alone, went to investigate the cause of the strange noises Kalin reported. He found a bloody glove in plain view. It appeared to match the blood-soaked glove found at the murder scene. Furman brought Van Natter to show him his discovery. Simpson's Rockingham estate was declared the second crime scene of the night. O.J. Simpson was now a prime suspect.
He was not a suspect initially when we went on the property. But once the glove had been found, he most definitely became a suspect.
According to the testimony of Philip Van Natter, as dawn broke over Los Angeles, he was able to see drops of blood in Simpson's driveway. They led from the Bronco to Simpson's house. Later, Van Atter found drops of blood in the entrance hall. As he looked into the Bronco, he saw still more traces of blood on the console and seat. Van Atter ordered the car seized and by 10:45 obtained a warrant to search the house for additional evidence. Meanwhile, Simpson returned from Chicago. Police had notified him by phone of his ex-wife's murder. He agreed to be interviewed by Detectives Lang and Van Atter without the presence of his lawyer. The detectives noticed a deep cut on a finger of his left hand. Van Atter asked Simpson repeatedly about the injury. His responses seemed inconsistent and contradictory. First, he said he cut his finger in Chicago on a broken glass. Then he changed his story and said he may have cut it in L.A. and reopened it in Chicago. To Lang and Van Atter, Simpson's explanation seemed evasive.
You're left-handed, Mr. Simpson?
They began to investigate his whereabouts on the night of the murders.
So you were cutting the knife, cutting the orange then with a knife in your right hand?
Police located the limousine driver who took Simpson to Los Angeles International Airport for his flight to Chicago. He had arrived at Simpson's estate ahead of schedule at 10:25 p.m.
Mr. Simpson?
He testified he didn't see the Bronco and received no answer when he pressed the buzzer at the gate. He then drove around the block and returned shortly before 11 p.m. The driver said at that time he noticed the Bronco parked on the street and saw an African-American male walking hurriedly up the driveway into the house. Then he saw a light go on. O.J. Simpson told him over the intercom that he'd overslept and would be down in a moment. Police believed the murders took place around 10:30. The prosecution felt Simpson's alibi couldn't hold up. They now had to find a motive. To build their case, police interviewed friends and family members of Nicole Brown. They suggested the killing was the final act of a vengeful and abusive husband. Nicole, battered and bruised, had called the police in 1989, charging that Simpson had beaten her.
911 emergency. Can you get someone over here now to 325 Gretna Green? He's back. Please. Okay, what does he look like? He's O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Could you just send somebody over here? Okay, what is he doing there? He just drove up again. He just drove me over. Okay, wait a minute. What kind of car is he in? He's in a white Bronco, but first of all, he broke the back door down to get in. Okay, wait a minute. What's your name? Nicole Simpson. Okay.
For his actions, a court ordered Simpson to perform community service. More recently, friends said he'd been stalking Nicole, threatening her and pressuring her to renew their marriage. Nicole had also become concerned about a missing set of keys to her condominium. They would resurface after his arrest.
Days before she was murdered, she told her mother that they were missing and she had thought Simpson had stolen them. And we find them on his person.
Based on the evidence they had collected, the LAPD filed formal charges against Orenthal James Simpson for the double murders. He was scheduled to deliver himself into custody at 11 a.m. on June 17, 1994. When he didn't arrive at police headquarters, the LAPD went to arrest him, only to find he had fled. As they began an extensive search, a television news helicopter began broadcasting images of Simpson and his friend A.C. Cowlings driving along the freeways of Los Angeles in a white Ford Bronco. After driving back to his Rockingham mansion, Simpson surrendered to police. The circumstantial and forensic evidence appeared to confirm Simpson's guilt. The prosecution felt it now had a case that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the case would raise a cloud of doubt about forensic science itself. A week into the investigation of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, the LAPD turned its case over to the District Attorney's Office. Prosecutors, along with the LAPD's Tom Lang and Phil Van Atter, were increasingly confident their case would hold up in court.
Phil and I talk about our last 10 murders combined don't have this evidence. So unquestionably, there's more evidence than that I challenge any prosecutor to tell me they've seen more, unless you've had it in, in Yankee Stadium in front of 80,000 people. I've never seen more evidence, or even heard of more evidence in a criminal case than this.
The prosecution accumulated what it felt to be a mountain of evidence. The 2 blood-stained gloves, blood found at the scene, in Simpson's Bronco, and on his clothing, as well as hair found on the knit cap, consistent with that of an African-American male.
This is very important evidence. Circumstantial, yes, but extremely important evidence. What's interesting on this case is every little thing like that ended up in the lap of O.J. Simpson. Nothing was exculpatory. Nothing said someone else was involved or a second person. Nothing says this guy didn't do it.
The trial of O.J. Simpson for the murder of his ex-wife Nicole Brown and her friend Ronald Goldman began in January 1995 in the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Because California state courts allow TV cameras, an audience of millions followed the trial day after day. It was the most watched trial in history. For LAPD detective Tom Lang, this made testifying difficult.
So I'm on the stand, and after all these days, and I've got a jury glaring at me, above them is this camera with 50-some-odd million people watching me live. Am I concentrating on that camera and all these millions of people that I know are watching me, or am I concentrating on the attorney and the questions being asked of me? That's the negative impact that much publicity can have on a case. And it did play a factor here.
The prosecution would try to prove that O.J. Simpson acted alone, killing Brown and Goldman with brutal efficiency. Brown's blood was found on Goldman and vice versa. To the prosecution, this meant the same knife had been used to kill both victims. To better understand how the murders could have been committed, the prosecution sought the expertise of crime scene reconstructionist and former homicide detective Rod Englert.
So I have to just look at the evidence, let the evidence do the talking, and then find support for that evidence to work out a logical sequence. That's what a reconstructionist does.
7 weeks after the murders, Englert first walked through the crime scene in an attempt to piece together the elements of his reconstruction.
So the first thing that I did was to get a feel for the scene, the dimensions, the space, walk through Nicole's home, upstairs, downstairs, and looking, and you might find this interesting. You know what I was looking for? I don't know what I was looking for. I just know it when I see it. I know what's out of place because of that experience. Not that I'm cerebral or anything, but you just, having seen these so many times, you just you recognize when something's not right.
This reconstruction is based on Englert's written report as presented to the court. It speculates how the crime may have occurred and how long it might take, assuming the prosecution's theory that O.J. Simpson was the killer. The defense contended that the murders would have involved a prolonged struggle of as much as 15 minutes. The prosecution, however, believed they took a total of 30 seconds.
The evidence suggests that when Nicole came out of her door, and we're going in slow motion, that she was approached by O.J. Simpson, who hit her on the head numerous times, and then she has 3 stab wounds to the left side of her neck that went very, very deep, and she goes down, causing abrasions to her elbow, to her face, from hitting the concrete. Then after she is down on the ground, then Ron Goldman walks up, and when he walks up, an altercation is between the two of them. The glove comes off because O.J. had his left arm around. The glove drops in the scene. and he incapacitates Ron Goldman and then goes back to Nicole and then picks up her hair, cuts her throat from left to right all the way back to her spine, lowers her head down, and then with the evidence that is on the knife goes back to and then cuts the throat of Ron Goldman, and then he's bleeding on the bars and then lays him over on his left side through that process. And this is a position that Goldman was in somewhat. Then he goes back to Nicole, steps on her back. There's a foot impression in this area on her back, and then leaves the scene.
Englert also came up with a theory about how the killer's glove had been left at the crime scene and how O.J. Simpson cut his hand.
That consistent with the glove being removed, this is how this occurrence happened, that during the struggle the glove came off and dropped to the ground. And notice that the knife blade at this point, and stick your finger out, would be parallel to where O.J. Simpson's hand would be, and that could come across and cut this incision that was on his finger. Everything is parallel. There's nothing cross section to it, and this is consistent with the evidence of a struggle, which can happen.
Prosecutors felt that by cutting his own finger, Simpson had inadvertently left a trail of blood that by itself was highly incriminating. That, plus his motive and lack of an alibi, was quite possibly enough to obtain a conviction. But prosecutors still had mostly circumstantial evidence against him. They would attempt to ice the case through DNA collected from the bloodstains. DNA analysis over the last 2 decades had begun to revolutionize criminal investigations. Until recently, blood evidence had limited use in helping identify criminals. By examining what are called the antigens in blood, scientists could determine its type, A, O, B, or AB, but could not trace a blood sample to any one individual. Beginning in the 1980s, science promised to make blood evidence much more significant by examining its DNA. Found in every cell of our bodies, DNA contains the coded instructions of our being. The color of our eyes, our height and hair color, the size of our brain, and so on. Since no 2 humans are alike, except identical twins, it follows that no 2 people have the same set of DNA instructions. By breaking the code, scientists have been able to identify the patterns or markers that distinguish one person's DNA from another's. 2 tests are used to isolate and identify human DNA. One, called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, requires a small sample of blood cells, which are then replicated to produce a larger sample. For the other test, called restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP, researchers must start with a much larger sample of cells. Most of the testing in the Simpson case used the simpler PCR test. Though most courts have accepted DNA evidence, there remains some controversy about its reliability and methods. Like critics of fingerprint science 100 years ago, some question whether we have truly broken the code. In addition to that, DNA science is difficult to explain and, for many jurors, hard to understand. The results of DNA analysis in the Simpson case were stunning. A prosecution expert testified that the drops of blood leading away from the murder scene were probably O.J. Simpson's. The odds the blood came from someone else were calculated at 1 in 170 million. Blood found on the back gate at the murder scene was also identified as Simpson's. Here, the odds of it being someone else's were 1 in several billion, greater than the population of the planet. This essentially proved the blood was Simpson's. Simpson's blood was also identified on the Bronco's door panel, dashboard, and near the headlight switch. Simpson told police he'd last driven the Bronco before dark on the day of the murders. Crime scene reconstructionist Rod Englert.
When do you turn on your headlights? Daytime? Not really. So there was a transfer on that dash which was blood consistent with O.J. Simpson's DNA. But even more remarkable was the console between the passenger seat and the driver's seat. And it had numerous transfer patterns. One was a hand pattern on the back far side of the console, on the console between the passenger seat and the console, which you can see distinctive finger marks, a transfer. And then there's another swipe. These transfers belong to, and it was blood consistent with, the DNA of Ron Goldman and Nicole Simpson.
But for the defense, forensic blood spatter expert Herbert McDonnell testified that he was leery of the blood found in the Bronco because it was so minute.
I don't see how anyone could have been in a struggle with Ron Goldman, or for that matter, Nicole Brown, where the blood was all over the area and not got much more blood on them than was reportedly on Mr. Simpson or in his Bronco. The Bronco, in my estimation, had less than 1 drop total in that whole vehicle.
Regardless of the blood in the Bronco, prosecution DNA tests had identified the ample blood from both murder victims on the glove found behind Cato Kalin's bungalow. The forensic evidence gathered by the police and prosecution pointed a bloody finger at O.J. Simpson. The defense would point its finger at the police. The defense in the Simpson case would focus its attack on a chain of events beginning in the wee hours of June 13, 1994. Defense attorney Barry Scheck contended that what happened, and what didn't happen, in the 24 hours following the murders was enough to cast doubt on the prosecution's case.
There was a lack of coordinated effort between the criminalists, the detectives, and the medical examiners. And you want to make sure that you keep everybody out of that crime scene until you have looked at it carefully, looking for the unexpected, making sure that you have seen absolutely everything before you allow all kinds of brass and supervisors to walk in and out, and begin to destroy the scene.
The defense set out to prove that evidence gathering went from bad to worse.
Well, the significance of the Simpson case lies in the way that crime scene was handled and its implications for the lab work. And we're talking here about the way that the criminalists on the scene collected the evidence, the way it was initially processed in the laboratories, and the way the medical examiner's office dealt with that.
At the scene of the murders on South Bundy Drive, camera crews arrived at 7:30 a.m. Rod Englert believes the cameras were a distraction that seriously affected the way the crime scene was handled.
It's just really difficult to do your job when just a few feet away you've got 15, 20 cameras over your shoulder that's going to be second-guessing you. Well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the evidence while you're down on your hands and knees? Or are you thinking about these people shooting up the back of your dress? You see what I'm saying?
Detective Lang, in charge of the investigation, couldn't stop the crews from filming. But he wanted to shield vital crime scene information so it wouldn't become public knowledge. Lang covered Brown's body with a blanket he found in her house. This would draw criticism at trial.
The bodies, of course, themselves are evidence. Blood patterns on the body are evidence. If you have a camera crew show up and videotape that, you've compromised it, and you can't necessarily use that if you had a potential suspect or a witness that you'd interview down the line. The media today has lens that could highlight a human hair at 200 feet. We're just honing in on the crime scene, on the one victim, Nicole Brown, in all of the evidence, compromising that evidence. That's one reason that body was covered.
They took a blanket, and they put it over the bodies, and they brought hairs and fibers all across that scene, when obviously some of the key pieces of evidence in the case might come down to hairs and fibers. Where did they come from?
Only one of the bodies had been covered, and Lang felt his reason was valid.
Did we contaminate it? There's always that possibility, but in this case it was exactly the right thing to do because there was no contamination. There were no foreign hairs, fibers, or debris found on Nicole Brown or her clothing. It was a tightly knit, clean hospital blanket that was used.
The cameras, meanwhile, became a useful tool for the defense.
We were able to get some of the videotape of the cameras looking in as the officers were processing the crime scene, and able to demonstrate that they weren't changing their gloves, that they were commingling some of the evidence, that people were walking in and out of the crime scene at times when they probably shouldn't have been.
The defense began a theme it would stress throughout the trial, that the blood evidence in the case had been contaminated. When blood is shed, bacteria immediately begins to break it down, along with its DNA. The defense suggested improper handling of the blood swatches had allowed the blood to deteriorate too far to permit accurate test results. Chief Criminalist Dennis Fung had relied primarily on swabbing the blood at the murder scene and transferring it to cotton swatches. The swatches were supposed to be dried, then wrapped in cloth bindles for transfer to the lab. But several of the bindles were blood-stained, proving the swatches were wet when placed inside. That could encourage bacterial contamination. Fung also left the blood evidence in his enclosed van for hours without air conditioning in the hot California sun.
And the last thing in the world one should do is put it into a plastic bag and stick it onto a truck, a crime scene truck, and let it bake for 7 hours, because you're going to degrade the DNA there.
That's a terrible mistake from the point of view of a criminalist, isn't it?
Yes.
The theme of contamination was one of the most hotly contested issues at the trial.
Murders do not occur in a sterile lab setting. There was contamination, there always has been. But they would lead you to believe that this somehow affected the outcome of this blood evidence, and the reality of it is it did not. The fact of the matter is, if you're looking strictly at the DNA in this case, you could have collected all of those blood samples and placed them out on Bundy Drive for a month, and let the traffic run up and down over them, and then collect them. Is that going to contaminate them? Well, sure, it's going to contaminate them. Is that going to change the DNA properties? Is that going to make O.J. Simpson's DNA appear there? No. It's there or it's not there. It's as simple as that.
But Scheck raised another argument, that criminalists at the scene may have commingled some of the blood samples so that no one could say whose blood was whose. Dennis Fung had first collected drops of Simpson's blood at O.J.'s home, then arrived at the murder scene to collect blood samples there. A grueling cross-examination by Barry Scheck raised serious doubts that Fung had changed his gloves, or even worn gloves, while collecting evidence at the murder scene.
And there were some moments during the trial where, I guess the moment that everybody remembers most is that Mr. Fung was picking up that envelope from the scene, and he was claiming that he, of course, did that with his gloves on. All of a sudden, in the courtroom, in a way we'd never even done it before because we had a better video machine in the courtroom, and you could see very, very clearly Dennis Fung grabbing the envelope and touching it without his glove on.
The defense went a step further. It argued that besides the inept collection procedures, more errors were committed when the samples were analyzed. It contended that the handling of the samples in the laboratory was so sloppy that the test results could not be relied upon.
This is a lab that was operating without a protocol, without procedures that people were trained in. Nobody ever taught them how to do it right. That was apparent.
As the defense steadily chipped away at the prosecution's case, another theory began to take shape.
Somebody played with this evidence.
A police conspiracy to frame O.J. Simpson. The mountain of forensic evidence in the Simpson case was turning to rubble. The defense now raised its own theory. Some of the evidence had been planted. The proof began at the gate of Nicole Brown's condominium. According to testimony, the police returned to the murder scene 3 weeks after the murders and found Simpson's blood on the back gate near the bloody shoe prints of the killer. Because it was missed during the initial investigation, the defense suggested it may not have been there at the time of the murder. Detective Tom Lang acknowledges the blood on the gate should have been collected earlier.
Generally at a crime scene, the detective will do a final walkthrough with the criminalists, photography people, latent print people, other detectives who have done canvassing and other things, and they'll walk through, did we do this, did we do that? If that had occurred here, we wouldn't have had the problem with the blood on the rear gate.
During his initial questioning, Simpson consented to giving police a blood sample. The defense suggested someone had planted some of it on the gate. Though presumably exposed to the elements 3 weeks longer, the DNA from the blood on the gate hadn't decomposed as much as the DNA from the blood collected hours after the crime. About the same time Simpson's blood was found on Nicole Brown's gate, Brown's blood was discovered on a pair of socks recovered from Simpson's house the night of the murders. Its significance wasn't missed by the prosecution or the defense. The prosecution's crime scene reconstructionist, Rod Englert, believes the drops of blood were spattered on the socks as Simpson stepped in his ex-wife's blood.
And on the socks we have a projected blood pattern of blood that had to be airborne. When it landed on these socks, creating numerous spots around the ankle and the front of one of them, and numerous match head size spots on the other. Now, I don't know which one was right or left, but those spots stopped at where the shoe would be on, if it was a regular street size shoe. Those spots stopped at a certain level on both of them where pant legs would be. And so when that was analyzed, I remember Tom Lang calling that evening, very excited, and said, "We were right. It was Nicole's blood."
To test his theory on how the blood would have been spattered on Simpson, Englert staged a reenactment. To recreate the struggle, he used police officers dressed in white so the blood would show up better. The white set matched the exact dimensions of the murder scene. The violent struggle between the killer and the second victim, Ronald Goldman, took place in close proximity to the deepening pool of blood from Nicole. Englert matched the amount of blood from the crime scene exactly and found that it would have been difficult to avoid spattering, as the test amply demonstrated. Forensics experts Herbert McDonnell and Henry Lee conducted their own examination of one of the socks found in Simpson's bedroom.
The ankle stain was very large. It was not spatter.
Both men claimed the blood had not been spattered at all.
It was not projected there. It was not dripped there. It was not cast off and landed there by flying through the air. It was transferred from contact by something that had blood on it.
Because the blood on the socks was not found between the fibers, McDonnell concluded it had been wiped across the sock.
The margin around the center of that stain shows blood on the surface of the fibers only. It does not show blood permeating between the fibers. Therefore, we know it's transferred.
McDonnell also found evidence that Simpson's foot was not in the sock when the blood transfer took place. McDonald uses a shirt sleeve to demonstrate how he thinks the blood was applied to the sock. He places a single drop of blood on top of the cloth, which he calls surface 1. He rubs the blood in, and it soaks onto the back, or surface 2. The blood is then transferred to surface 3, but does not soak through to surface 4. McDonald and Lee found that blood had seeped through from sides 1 and 2 of Simpson's sock onto side 3, which would have been impossible if Simpson's foot had been inside the sock between surface 2 and surface 3. To the defense, this was compelling evidence the blood could have been planted on the sock, either at the crime scene or while the socks were in police custody. The conspiracy theory was supported by defense experts who found the presence of a substance called EDTA in both the blood on the sock and the blood from the gate at the crime scene. EDTA is a preservative added to blood in a test tube to prevent it from clotting. It's also present naturally in small quantities in the human bloodstream. But witnesses testified that the amount of EDTA in the 2 bloodstains was much higher than normal, suggesting the blood on the gate and the socks came from the lab. Down but not defeated, the prosecution brought out its most dramatic evidence.
We can find the mate to it.
The trial of O.J. Simpson reached a turning point with the pair of gloves. Commingled on them was the blood of both murder victims. According to testimony at trial, one glove was found at the scene of the murders, the other on Simpson's property on Rockingham Drive. But a now infamous courtroom demonstration seriously undermined the evidence. The prosecution team decided to have Simpson try on the gloves in front of the jury. The result was a disaster. The gloves apparently did not fit. The prosecution was forced to scramble for an explanation. A former executive of the company that manufactured the gloves testified that when soaked in blood and allowed to dry, the gloves might shrink 10 to 15%. To see if that was possible, McDonald tested this theory with an identical pair of gloves.
So I took the gloves that were sent to me and I poured my own blood over these gloves in a controlled condition, so I knew exactly how much blood remained on the gloves. They were really wet. The blood was worked into them, and then they were allowed to dry.
Prior to the experiment, McDonald photocopied the glove to document its size. After the bloody glove dried, he again photocopied it for comparison. It had shrunk less than 1%. Next, he wanted to find out how small the glove would become if it really did shrink as much as the manufacturer claimed. He used the photocopier to reduce the glove to 10 and 15% of its original size. Then he compared the reductions to the original photocopy. The change was enormous. At 15%, the gloves would have shrunk over 1.5 inches. In McDonald's opinion, the change was too drastic. Since it seemed unlikely that the gloves belonged to Simpson, the defense had an opening to expand its theory of a police conspiracy. It had already suggested that someone had planted blood on the back gate at the murder scene and on the socks from Simpson's bedroom. Now it put forward the theory that the glove found on Simpson's property had also been deliberately planted. Mark Furman had been alone when he found the glove at Simpson's house. He'd also been among the first detectives to arrive at Brown's condominium, where the first glove had been found. The defense suggested that Furman had picked up the second glove at the scene of the murders, taken it with him to Simpson's estate, and planted it on the pathway behind Cato Kalin's bungalow. For LAPD Detective Lang, it would have been impossible for Furman to have found the second glove at the scene of the murders because he was the 13th detective to sign the log.
because 12 people there before Furman only saw one glove. And it's very logical the way Furman found the glove. He was doing what anybody should have done, following up on an interview with Cato Kalin.
Taking its theory a step further, the defense suggested that before he planted the glove, Furman may have used it to smear the blood of the victims inside Simpson's Bronco. It was a claim that made the LAPD's blood boil.
Mark Furman did not plant any blood. Absolutely. He did not do it. He would have no knowledge how to do that. And there's no evidence of that whatsoever. None. There was no sprinkling of blood in that Bronco whatsoever. There weren't any drops. That was all transfers. And the significance of it was that it was transferred in the patterns consistent with one who had blood on his hands or possible clothing to get in and open the door, open the interior door, turn on the lights, touch over here with a hand transfer, and if implements or something was placed on the seat to be able to do that, someone would have to be so knowledgeable and so cerebral about predicting what was going to happen that I don't have that capability. I don't know anybody that does to be able to make it consistent. And then to do it on the socks at the house, impossible.
The defense had no real evidence that the glove was planted, and at first it could provide no motive for Furman to plant it. But that soon changed.
You say on your oath that you have not addressed any black person as a nigger or spoken about black people as niggers in the past 10 years, Detective Furman.
That's what I'm saying, sir.
So that anyone who comes to this court and quotes you as using that word in dealing with African Americans would be a liar, would they not, Detective Furman?
Yes, they would.
All of them, correct?
All of them.
In one of the trial's most dramatic moments, the defense introduced evidence that Furman had expressed hatred toward blacks. The defense had found its final weapon for casting doubt on the prosecution's case. It played the race card. Tom Lang feels the issue of race was irrelevant.
Furman's racism or whatever else Furman is has nothing to do with the two people getting murdered. It's unfortunate he was in the middle of it for the first couple hours, but you have to deal with that. And if you think he's planted evidence or anything else, we need to see evidence of that.
Case number BA097211.
The prosecution had been so certain of its forensic evidence, it had withheld other evidence pointing to Simpson's guilt for fear of exhausting the jury's patience.
A felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson.
But the defense had effectively nullified each piece it presented, claiming it had been contaminated by sloppy handling and a disregard for the procedures established to protect it. On October 3rd, 1995, Orenthal James Simpson was found not guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Tom Lang is convinced the jury disregarded the compelling evidence the prosecution had put forward.
Prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. I've never seen so much evidence. Even there was a tremendous amount of evidence they didn't put on, but there was a tremendous amount they did. I've never seen that much put on in a case. When a jury comes back in 2.5 hours, it's pretty evident they didn't do what they were instructed to do, regardless of the outcome, regardless if it's guilty or not guilty. They did not do what they were told to do, and the court did not follow up on that.
Defense attorney Barry Scheck feels the jury's verdict was based squarely on reasonable doubt. He believes the way the LAPD handled the evidence was totally inadequate.
People in the forensic community recognized that this was wrong, that these procedures were unacceptable. The more sophisticated the technology, the more powerful the forensic evidence, the greater the importance that these people develop and are able to maintain a high sense of independence and professionalism. That kind of laboratory is the kind of laboratory, the kind of crime scene people that are our best protection for convicting the truly guilty and exonerating the truly innocent.
After Simpson's acquittal, lawyers representing the victims' families in a civil suit would learn from the mistakes of the criminal trial. They would bring in circumstantial evidence not presented earlier, such as the fact that Simpson owned a pair of the expensive Bruno Magli shoes like those that left their imprint at the scene of the crime. The prosecution only had to convince a majority of the jurors beyond a 50% certainty that Simpson was guilty. The prosecution was successful, and O.J. Simpson was found liable for the deaths of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown. He was required to pay $33.5 million to the victims' families. During the criminal trial, the prosecution had what it believed to be irrefutable evidence. It was wrong. Careless handling and collection techniques robbed the evidence of its power. It served only to raise doubt. The aftermath of the Simpson trial resonated throughout the halls of science. Forensics itself was put on the stand, and it became clear that the most reliable witness can also be the most easily compromised.
Don't peek.
In a Baltimore, Maryland suburb, a game of hide-and-seek turns deadly for a 9-year-old girl. Witnesses ID a suspect and trap him in a web of circumstantial evidence.
What does she look like?
8 years later, only DNA technology can render the final verdict. In California, a woman is viciously attacked in her sleep by a suspected serial killer. After she slips into a coma, investigators struggle to identify a suspect. When she regains consciousness, she IDs her attacker, and he is no stranger. In the past, eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence could spell doom for a suspect without an ironclad alibi. Today, forensics experts are clearing the falsely accused using DNA to uncover proof of innocence. On the afternoon of July 25, 1984, in the Baltimore, Maryland suburb of Rosedale, police responded to a father's frantic 911 call. Thomas Hamilton reported that his 9-year-old daughter Dawn was missing. His sister had been babysitting Dawn and Dawn's cousin Lisa that morning.
It's just behind the apartment houses.
8-year-old Lisa told police that she and Dawn had left to go play at a nearby pond around 10:30. The surrounding wooded area was a great place to play hide-and-go-seek.
15, no, 20. 1. No peeking. 3.
But after some time, the two became separated.
6, 7.
Lisa couldn't find her cousin and thought that maybe Dawn had decided to go back home. But she had not returned. After an hour passed without a word, the aunt became concerned and contacted her brother. Thomas Hamilton knew that Dawn was familiar with the woods and thought it was unlikely that she had simply become lost. He feared that something terrible had happened. A search party made up of family, friends, and law enforcement officers began combing the wooded area behind the apartment complex. After several hours, their efforts had turned up nothing. Then, around 5 o'clock, one of the searchers made an ominous discovery. A pair of child's underwear was found hanging from a tree branch. Investigators quickly began searching the immediate area. Within a few minutes, their worst fears were confirmed. Lying face down in a pile of brush, they found the lifeless body of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton.
Got a body here. Appears to be a little girl. I'm not feeling the pulse.
Her skull had been crushed,
On the north side of the pond, just up the hill. We need some help.
and there were indications that she had been sexually assaulted. Evidence technicians were dispatched to the scene. They preserved the girl's underwear, hoping some trace of her killer remained. Investigators collected a large piece of cinder block found near the victim's head. It appeared to be consistent with having caused the trauma to Dawn's skull. The body was removed from the scene and sent to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Word of the young girl's death quickly spread through the city. Tony Pipitone, a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun at the time of the homicide, followed the investigation. The murder of Dawn Hamilton would soon become front-page news.
This was a huge story for this area. I mean, it's not every day a 9-year-old girl disappears and then turns up murdered. There were a lot of people out there. There was a lot of concern about who the killer was and whether they would find this killer.
Investigators hoped the autopsy might provide some clues to the killer's identity. The medical examiner determined that Dawn Hamilton had not died as a result of the blunt force trauma to the head. After being beaten, she was then strangled. Though there were also indications that the young girl had been sexually assaulted, the medical examiner found no evidence of rape. However, a minuscule amount of biological evidence was recovered from the underwear. The samples were collected and analyzed, but in the days before DNA testing was available, examiners were unable to provide police with a specific genetic profile of the killer. Investigators turned to the public for help, but no leads were developed.
I want to ask you about what happened at the pond.
But a short while later, 2 boys from the Rosedale neighborhood came in to speak with police. They had seen Dawn with a strange man at the pond just hours before the young girl's body was found. The boys had been searching the area for turtles earlier that morning. When they spotted a stranger fishing by the side of the pond, they decided to show off their catch.
Lisa!
As they were talking to the man, Dawn Hamilton emerged from the woods. She was looking for her cousin Lisa and asked if the boys would help her. They declined, but the stranger offered to help. Moments later, Dawn disappeared into the woods with the man. The boys described the stranger as being about 6'5", having curly blonde hair and a mustache. With the help of a police sketch artist, the face of the murder suspect began to take shape. For everyone following the investigation, it was clear that this was a huge break for police.
They had the 2 boys who had seen her go down this trail with this man who had offered to help her find her friend. And they believed whoever that man was would be key to solving this case.
The composite sketch of Dawn Hamilton's suspected killer was quickly distributed through the media. Police also took the drawing door to door throughout Rosedale. Several neighbors claimed to have seen the man lurking around the area on the day of the murder. But no one had seen him before then, and no one knew his name. As the investigation threatened to stall, pressure to solve the case mounted. Again, police turned to the media for help.
It's Tony Pipitone.
Desperate to generate a lead, detectives released a psychological profile of Dawn's killer through all area newspapers.
The detectives had this profile done that said that whoever was responsible for this crime may have had an argument with a woman, a domineering woman in his life, may have been projecting that anger at that woman at this little girl. They said that whoever did this, according to this profile, grew up around the water because he was near the pond and where these boys were fishing and had gone to this pond as some kind of refuge in a troubled time.
And what's your name?
Hundreds of tips poured into police.
Thanks for calling.
One anonymous caller said he recognized the composite and the psychological description as a man he knew named Kirk Bloodsworth. A detective who overheard the conversation was familiar with that name. Kirk Bloodsworth had been reported missing by his wife, and the report was filed shortly after Dawn Hamilton was found murdered. Believing there may be a connection, investigators quickly arranged to speak with Bloodsworth's wife. She said in the weeks before Dawn's murder, she and her husband's marriage began to deteriorate.
We had a big fight last.
And why hasn't it been paid yet?
Throwing things at me?
Kirk accused her of spending beyond their means. Frustrated, she fought with him constantly. As the tensions mounted, Kirk became distant and preoccupied. A week or so after Dawn's murder, Kirk disappeared. She hadn't heard from him since.
How long had he been missing when you filed the report?
Investigators realized that Kirk Bloodsworth was involved in a turbulent relationship, just as the profile of the killer had indicated.
Well, I think we got everything.
And, like the profile also suggested, he was drawn to the water. Kirk's wife said that her husband may have returned to his hometown, located on the Chesapeake Bay.
Using that profile, it all fit together. Kirk Bloodsworth grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was from a fisherman family.
Kirk Bloodsworth was now the prime suspect in the murder of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton. But as long as his whereabouts remained uncertain, so did the prospects of solving this case. Authorities in the Baltimore, Maryland suburb of Rosedale believed they had finally identified a suspect in the brutal sexual assault and murder of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton, whose body was discovered in a wooded area a few hundred yards from her home. An anonymous caller had identified a composite sketch of the suspect as resembling a man named Kirk Bloodsworth, who disappeared a week after the murder. Bloodsworth's wife speculated he had returned to his hometown of Cambridge on Maryland's eastern shore. Police canvassed the small fishing community. They located one of Bloodsworth's friends. He confirmed that the suspect had in fact recently returned to Cambridge. Bloodsworth told him that he had done something terrible and couldn't return to Baltimore. The friend didn't ask any more questions. He told police where Bloodsworth was currently staying. The suspect was contacted and brought in for questioning. Though Kirk Bloodsworth denied any involvement in the homicide, he was unable to recount exactly where he was at the time the murder occurred. Detectives next asked him what he had done that was so terrible that he couldn't return to Baltimore. Bloodsworth responded that he had failed to take his wife out for a taco salad dinner, and he knew she would never forgive him. To police, the explanation was ludicrous. Investigators produced a large piece of cinder block, similar to the one found at the crime scene, and a photo of the victim to see how the suspect would react.
They placed the rock in the interview room without referring to it specifically, and they watched his reaction. And I remember one of the detectives saying you could see him just kept going, staring back at that rock. You know, his eyes would shift back at that rock, back at that rock.
Everything about the suspect led authorities to believe that he was Dawn Hamilton's killer. Now, 2 decades later, Kirk Bloodsworth recalls that there was nothing he could have said to convince them he was not involved in the murder.
And they kept drilling me, and all I kept saying was, I didn't do it. I'm telling you, I didn't do it. No, I might not know exactly where I was right then and there right now, but I didn't do it. I know whatever it wasn't killing a little girl that day.
Stop me, all right?
But the evidence continued to suggest otherwise. The boys who helped create the composite sketch of the suspect were shown a photo lineup. Though Bloodsworth was shorter and heavier than the boys had described, and his hair was a different color, they picked him out as the man they had seen with Dawn near the pond. Several Rosedale residents also identified photographs of Bloodsworth as the man they saw hanging around the day of the murder. In the early morning hours of August 9th, 1984, police traveled to Bloodsworth's cousin's home on the Eastern Shore, where he was staying at the time.
It was 2:45 in the morning, and he said, there he is. And I physically turned around and looked the other way because I was expecting them to see, my cousin's boyfriend or something, or somebody else, not me. And I was just in total shock by the fact that there was 20 people on the lawn with guns and police cars. They were surrounded the house, front and back, all over the place.
Don Hamilton.
Kirk Bloodsworth was charged with first-degree murder. And though the case against him was circumstantial, prosecutors sought the harshest penalty.
You had the boys who identified him as being the man that went in the woods with Don Hamilton. It was eyewitness identification. There was nothing forensically solid placing him at the scene or placing him as a killer of this girl.
Still, it took less than 3 hours for the jury to find the defendant guilty of murder and sexual assault. 2 weeks later, 21-year-old Kirk Bloodsworth returned for sentencing.
Kirk stood up and said, this is a travesty, this is misjustice, he would never do that to a girl. The judge sentenced him to death.
One of the most horrible feelings I ever had was when they sentenced me to death and the courtroom erupted in applause for my execution.
From prison, Bloodsworth committed himself to overturning his conviction. He eventually received an appeal, and at a second trial, the judge commuted his death sentence to 2 consecutive life terms. But for a man claiming he had nothing to do with the murder of Dawn Hamilton, that was hardly a consolation. Kirk Bloodsworth dedicated himself to finding irrefutable proof of his innocence, no matter how long it took. 8 years into a double life sentence for the murder of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton, Kirk Bloodsworth was no closer to convincing Maryland authorities that he had been wrongly convicted.
I talked to anyone and everyone that I could. The person in the visiting room that I didn't even know, the guard that was walking me from there, the dental technician at sick call, the priest that comes see me every week. I wrote thousands of letters over the 8-year period. I just kept trying to get somebody to listen to me. And all it did was fall on deaf ears.
Then, several years later, he learned of a new forensic technology where DNA analysis was being used to convict criminals. Bloodsworth had an idea.
I thought, well, if it can implicate somebody and prove that they did do it, it can also exonerate a person, set them free.
Dr. Ed Blake of the Forensic Science Associates Lab in Northern California agreed that recent advancements in DNA technology could now offer Bloodsworth hope that previously didn't exist.
Well, at the time that Dawn Hamilton was murdered, there was no DNA technology for all intents and purposes. It's not that that the science didn't know about DNA. Certainly, generally, science did know about DNA. It's just that the technology for doing work in a forensic setting hadn't evolved to the point where that technology was useful in a forensic setting.
Fortunately for Kirk Bloodsworth, things had changed since the mid-1980s. Examiners began looking into the case. The only item that potentially held exonerating evidence was Dawn's underwear found at the crime scene. Examiners, however, were confronted with two immediate problems. First, there was no guarantee that any genetic material remained on the garment. Secondly, even if there was, the evidence had been stored in a non-climate controlled environment for nearly 9 years, making it likely that any DNA samples would be too degraded to be useful. But examiners were in luck. A stain found on the fabric appeared to be a trace amount of biological evidence. Under a high-powered microscope, examiners confirmed that they had found a viable sample. One single gene strand was located. In the past, this minute sample would have been too small for testing. But now scientists had a new technique, referred to as PCR analysis. The technique allows examiners to isolate a single gene strand containing DNA material. Once isolated, the DNA is then copied millions of times over, so that enough copies of a specific gene can be readily subjected to analysis.
You can think about DNA like the letters in a book. The letters in a book, which are formed into sentences, and the sentences are formed into paragraphs, and the paragraphs into chapters. A book has a 26-letter code. Well, DNA has a 4-letter code. The PCR process, in effect, searches the entire book of sentences to copy the one sentence that you're interested in looking at, and then copying those over and over so the sentence is easier to read.
The procedure was successful. After comparing the genetic profile of Kirk Bloodsworth to the one generated from the evidence, Dr. Blake concluded that Bloodsworth could not have killed Dawn Hamilton. The inmate was contacted with the news.
I had tears running down my face and my hands were up in the air. I went down the tier in front of the cell screaming that it's over. Now, I remember throwing my hands up in the air like this and just totally elated.
These were Kirk Bloodsworth's last seconds behind bars.
Maryland's governor immediately pardoned Bloodsworth. On June 28, 1993, after spending nearly 9 years behind bars, he was released from prison. He was later awarded $300,000 in compensation. Though he returned home to the Eastern Shore, the homecoming was bittersweet. Kirk's mother had not lived to see him a free man.
My mom knew. She knew her son. She knew anybody that she raised was not like that. And I guess all moms think that way, but she knew her son well. Knew me well. Well enough to know that I was innocent of what I was in there for.
For police in Rosedale, Maryland, as long as Dawn Hamilton's real killer remains at large, the investigation into her murder will never be closed. In Maryland, an innocent man was freed thanks to advanced forensic technology. A convicted killer in Southern California also claims to be paying the price for another man's crime. Around 2 a.m. on September 30th, 1979, Kevin Green returned to his Tustin, California apartment after leaving to pick up some fast food. Though he was only gone for half an hour, clothes were now scattered around the residence. On the couple's bed, he found his pregnant wife, Diana, unconscious. She was bleeding badly. Green quickly called police. Police and emergency personnel raced to the scene. Diana was alive, but in critical condition. She had been savagely beaten. After stabilizing the victim, paramedics rushed Diana to the hospital. There, the 20-year-old expectant mother lapsed into a coma. Crime scene technicians began scouring the residence, looking for any trace of the assailant that may have been left behind. But no fingerprints or any stray hairs or fibers were found. There was no indication that anything had been stolen from the apartment. Blood and trace amounts of what appeared to be biological evidence were recovered from the bed. With the only witness to the assault in a coma, police turned to her husband, Kevin Green, for answers. The Marine Corps corporal told investigators that he and Diana had friends over for drinks earlier that evening.
It won't be long, honey.
Okay. Around 1:30 a.m., shortly after the guests left, Kevin was hungry and decided to go out for some fast food. There were several parties in the neighborhood. Kevin forgot to lock the door. As he made his way to his car, he noticed an African-American male walking aimlessly down the street. He had never seen the man before. But with all of the parties going on, Green thought nothing of it. When he returned a half hour later, he saw the same man climbing into a black van. He didn't get a good look at the stranger's face. After watching the van pull away, Green made his way inside. Kevin now believed that the stranger was involved in the assault on Diana. He added that his and Diana's marriage was a good one. To this day, Kevin Green can't imagine why anyone would have attacked his wife.
There's no reason in my mind. I can't think of any warnings I've heard or any reference to anything like this. She doesn't have any enemies. I don't have any enemies. Why would this happen? What has happened?
At the crime lab, technicians began trying to answer those questions. Biological evidence recovered from the victim's body and the bed confirmed Diana Green had been sexually assaulted. But in the days before DNA profiling, there was little investigators could do to tie this sample to a specific individual, even if a suspect emerged. And that wasn't the only obstacle facing investigators. Though the victim was still alive, Costa Mesa homicide detective Barbara Geisler knew she would have to make her case without the eyewitness testimony of Diana Green.
Her injuries to her head was described to me by the doctors at the hospital as if she had fallen off a two-story building head first. And it was really a miracle that she survived. And so she suffered from lapse of memory.
It's not looking good. I think some of your problems flow into
As soon as
my
investigators began reviewing the details of Diana Green's assault, something immediately caught their attention.
almost similar.
The MO was frighteningly similar to 4 unsolved rapes and murders that had occurred throughout Orange County within the past 9 months. All the young female victims were found sexually assaulted and brutally beaten to death. And in each homicide, the killer apparently entered the victims' residences through unlocked doors.
No.
Nothing was taken from any of the apartments, suggesting the perpetrator had not been motivated by robbery. Though Diana was the only victim who was married and the only victim to have survived, detectives were convinced the crimes were connected.
The apartment was downstairs. She was home alone at the time of the incident. The apartment did not appear to be ransacked. There didn't appear to be anything taken. There was no theft or burglary involved. She was sexually assaulted and also bludgeoned. That's enough similarity certainly to get your attention.
Though Diana Green had miraculously survived an attack by a serial killer, her unborn baby girl was barely clinging to life. The day after the assault, while still lingering in a coma, the situation turned critical.
A nurse came in to do the next check on the baby. She was listening to the baby's heartbeat, and then she lost it. And she kept looking for the heartbeat and kept looking. She couldn't find it. There wasn't any warning. There wasn't any anything anybody could do. The baby's heartbeat stopped. And by the time they realized that that's actually what had happened, the baby hadn't just turned. It was too late.
The serial killer, who the press dubbed the bedroom basher, had claimed another innocent life. And though publicity surrounding the murder of the unborn baby sent shockwaves through the community, no solid leads were developed. Then, 8 days after Diana Green was assaulted, police were called to an apartment complex just 3 blocks from her residence. There had been another homicide. The body of 24-year-old Deborah Kennedy was discovered by her roommate. The coroner at the scene concluded that the young woman had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death in her first-floor apartment. Police were able to collect biological evidence of rape, but no other clues to the killer's identity were found. Tustin Police Lieutenant Bill Fisher was assigned the case. It was clear to him that Deborah Kennedy and Diana Green had both been victimized by the same predator.
So we found that they were both in their early 20s. They lived about 1.5 miles apart from one another. The attacks themselves were both very similar, blows to the forehead with some kind of a blunt object, and they had both been sexually assaulted.
There had now been 6 similar attacks in less than a year. 5 women and an unborn baby were dead. Detectives had no leads.
It's difficult to say.
And though Diana had emerged from her coma, the injuries to her brain were taking longer to heal than expected. Without her testimony, identifying the bedroom basher would be difficult. A month later, after being released from the hospital, Diana was finally getting her memory back. And she was anxious to meet with police. Though she had not regained her speech, she was able to communicate the identity of her attacker.
You know what he hit you with?
The person responsible for the death of her baby was not a stranger. It was her husband, Kevin Green.
Remember what he hit you with?
Police in Costa Mesa and Tustin, California, struggled to identify a suspect in a string of brutal sexual assaults that had claimed the lives of 5 women and 1 unborn child. 20-year-old Diana Green, who lost her baby as a result of a brutal beating by the suspected serial killer, finally regained her memory of the attack and then filed an official statement with police. Detective Barbara Geisler reviewed Diana's testimony. Diana claimed that her husband, Marine Corps Corporal Kevin Green, was her assailant. According to Diana, on the night she was assaulted, she and Kevin had a heated argument. Kevin wanted to have sex, but Diana, then 9 months pregnant, refused his advances. As a result, Kevin attacked her, smashing her in the forehead with his keychain before raping her. Suddenly, investigators had to consider that Kevin Green was also responsible for the other 5 unsolved homicides throughout Orange County. But after retracing his movements over the previous year, it was clear that he could not be the bedroom basher. However, he could have staged the attack on his wife to make it look like the crime of the serial killer.
In fact, the phrase that was coined at that time, and I think is used today, is that possibly the husband had committed the crime, quote unquote, as a look-alike, keeping in mind all of the homicides that were occurring had been publicized greatly throughout the counties.
To confirm their suspicions, police began interviewing the couple's friends and associates. Though Kevin had told police his marriage to Diana was solid, one of the couple's neighbors said that the two would often have heated arguments that could be heard throughout the complex. Investigators next interviewed the couple that had spent time with Kevin and Diana just hours before the assault. They described a tense relationship. They recalled that just after Diana learned she was pregnant, Kevin became abusive toward her during dinner one night. He was convinced she would use the pregnancy to avoid being intimate with him. The friends didn't think the marriage was a happy one. Convinced they were on the right track, investigators brought Kevin Green in for questioning. Looking to corroborate Diana's story, investigators collected his keychain that he allegedly used to beat her with. Later analysis revealed no traces of blood. But Kevin Green couldn't explain how or why his wife had memories of him attacking her. He insisted he had nothing to do with her assault. He maintained that at the time of the attack, he was across town getting fast food. For Lieutenant Bill Fisher of the Tustin Police Department, something about the suspect's alibi was suspicious.
One of the things that didn't make a whole lot of sense to us is that the fast food place he went to was an identical one to a fast food restaurant that was directly across the street from where he lived. Both restaurants were open 24 hours for drive-through purposes at the time of the crime. Yet he chose to bypass the one that was across the street and drive to the same type of establishment in the community next door.
Looking to catch Kevin Green in a lie, investigators interviewed the store employee who had worked the night he allegedly pulled into the drive-thru. The clerk confirmed Kevin Green's story. She remembered serving him around 1:30 or 2 a.m. on the night of the assault.
Appreciate it.
The information appeared to be a setback for investigators. But when they factored the driving distance into a timeline of the evening, police realized that Kevin would have had just enough time to attack his wife and establish an alibi. More importantly, the suspect could not explain away the eyewitness testimony of his own wife.
She was so emphatic about the fact that it was Kevin that attacked her. We were unable to show anything different.
On November 30th, 1980, the Marine Corps corporal was handed over to police and placed under arrest. Green maintained his innocence, convinced that the real culprit was the stranger he had seen outside his apartment the night of the assault. Police felt otherwise.
They arrested me and threw me in jail on first-degree murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon with great bodily injury. $250,000 bail and headlines for all the world to see. Marine arrested in the beating, attack, and death of his daughter.
Kevin Green mounted a strong defense at trial, but Diana's emotional testimony won over the jury. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. Though Green fought to overturn his conviction, his efforts went unrewarded. 15 years into his sentence, he had exhausted all of his appeals. Because he never showed remorse for the crimes that he insisted he hadn't committed, Kevin Green was turned down for parole in 1988, 1991, 1993, and 1995. Green resigned himself to the fact that he would die in prison. A self-proclaimed innocent man. 15 years into a life sentence for assaulting his pregnant wife and killing their unborn baby, Kevin Green continued to maintain his innocence. But with all of his appeals exhausted, his only hope for justice was that the real culprit, who Green believed to be the serial killer known as the Bedroom Basher, would someday be caught. But Tustin and Costa Mesa police had been unable to identify a suspect in the 5 unsolved 1979 homicides. The investigations into those murders had ground to a halt. But in the summer of 1995, Tustin police detective Tom Tarpley learned of a new national database called CODIS, the Combined DNA Identification Index, that had the potential to re-energize those investigations.
We were instructed that a database existed in which you could take evidence from unsolved cases, develop a genetic profile from that evidence, and then that evidence would be put into a computer which is maintained by the state of California that holds genetic profiles of known offenders, people who are in prison or have been convicted of certain serious crimes. So you could take the two genetic profiles and see if there was a match between the unsolved case and the known offender.
Detective Tarpley requested the case files for any of the unsolved serial murders that contained potential DNA evidence.
Here's that file.
Lieutenant Bill Fisher, who had also worked the case against Kevin Green, had one. He turned over the file of 24-year-old Deborah Kennedy, who was bludgeoned to death within days of the assault on Diana Green.
When Lieutenant Fisher brought me the Deborah Kennedy case file, I went through that file looking at the physical evidence, and it appeared that there was a rape kit that was taken at the time of her discovery.
Hoping to close one of the unsolved Bedroom Basher murders, detectives retrieved the sexual assault kit and sent it to the Orange County Sheriff's Crime Lab for analysis. But now, more than 16 years since the specimen was collected, criminalist Frank Fitzpatrick wasn't sure if the old sample would be of any use.
The problem was that the sexual assault kit had not been refrigerated, had not been frozen, and we really had no idea of what kind of shape this biological evidence was going to be in. We asked one of our DNA analysts to work through the night and to see what they could do with trying to extract some DNA from this.
Technicians were in luck. Trace amounts of genetic material were extracted from a clipping of Deborah Kennedy's bed sheets. Using the PCR technique, the DNA was then copied so that criminalists would have enough material to test. The analysis produced a genetic profile of Deborah Kennedy's killer. When investigators entered the profile into the CODIS database, they found an identical match. The biological evidence had originated from a man who was currently serving time for rape in a Central California prison. Investigators went to the jail to question 40-year-old Gerald Parker, now linked to one of the Bedroom Basher murders. Though he was indirect and evasive, Parker implied that he was responsible for the Kennedy murder.
He did not, for example, come out and say, "I did this." He just would not say that I didn't do this, which sometimes is just as good as an admission. So it was kind of a game of cat and mouse at that point.
Investigators persisted And finally, Parker admitted to killing Deborah Kennedy. And there was another attack he wanted to talk about. Gerald Parker, a former Marine, claimed that he was the man who had assaulted Diana Green back in 1979. Her husband, Kevin Green, was innocent. Parker said that on September 30th, 1979, he slipped into the Greens' apartment after seeing Kevin get into his car and leave. Using a 2x4, he attacked Diana as she slept in her bed. He then sexually assaulted her and made his way out of the apartment. He completed his brutal attack in less than half an hour and left the apartment just as Kevin returned home. Though police were unable to explain Diana's memory of the assault, they were now confronted with the possibility that Kevin Green may have been innocent after all.
My feeling was, we've got a big problem here. You know, we've got a guy that is in prison, locked up for a number of years for murder that he didn't commit, but it became our job to show that Parker was in fact the real killer, and that's where the human element came in. We had to get that information from him that could ultimately set Kevin Green free if in fact he wasn't the offender.
And the best way to do that was through the physical evidence. The biological samples recovered from the Diana Green case and samples from all of the unsolved bedroom basher murders were sent out for a DNA analysis. At the Orange County Sheriff's Crime Lab, examiners generated a genetic profile of all of the samples. They all shared the same genetic code. And they had all originated from Gerald Parker. The findings were passed on to investigators.
So now we had conclusive physical evidence as well as testimonial evidence that Gerald Parker was there and that he raped Diana Green. That then created a reasonable doubt in all of our minds in law enforcement that we could not stand by the conviction of Kevin Green anymore, and the process then began to free him.
On June 20th, 1996, after being locked up for nearly 17 years, Kevin Green was released from prison. After being driven to the airport by detectives, he made his first phone call as a free man.
I called my dad and I asked him, I said, guess where I'm at? And he'd always thought I would try to escape, so he says, well, I know where you're supposed to be. I told him I'm in the Salinas airport and they're taking me down to Orange County to let me go. I'm coming home. And it was just stunned silence there for a minute, and he says, do you have handcuffs on? I said, nope. And so he believed at that moment that a convicted murderer is not leaving a prison without handcuffs unless he ain't coming back.
In 1998, Gerald Parker was tried and convicted of the assault on Diana Green and the murder of her unborn child. He was also found guilty of slaying the other 5 bedroom basher victims. Gerald Parker was sentenced to death.
My opinion of the DNA database is that it's probably the single greatest thing to ever happen to law enforcement and into the criminal justice system. Not only can you convict people of crimes that would have gotten away with serious crimes such as rape and murder, but you can also, as we see in the Kevin Green case, free people that were erroneously convicted.
Kevin Green returned to his hometown in the Midwest. And though he has remarried and gotten on with his life, this experience will always be with him.
An experience like this, like any other experience in life, is going to change you. Time went by. I changed in a lot of ways. I grew up. I became more mature. I got a good education, which is very important. I learned how to read a lot better. I mean, I graduated high school by the skin of my teeth. I graduated college in prison with an A average. So it wasn't my lack of intelligence, it was my lack of focus. I understand, I think, a lot more about life. I'm willing to accept a lot of things easier than people around me do, because I feel like God has a plan and a reason for things to happen in certain ways.
The experiences of people like Kirk Bloodsworth and Kevin Green have not gone unnoticed. On February 11, 2000, Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, introduced the Innocence Protection Act, a bill designed to ensure that no more innocent people are convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
If you're going to say you're going to put somebody behind bars for all their life, or you're going to execute them, that's a pretty major step for society to take. And you better be sure you're convicting somebody who is guilty. Right now we have a system where you can't say that. Right now you have a system where a lot of innocent people get convicted. It doesn't have to be that way. It's relatively easy to make sure that doesn't happen. It's time we make sure it doesn't happen.
Homicide investigators must often rely on circumstantial evidence to win a conviction. But sometimes things aren't what they appear to be. With advanced forensic technology, science can render the final verdict and find justice for the falsely accused by uncovering proof of innocence.